Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our annual architecture lecture. I'm Chip Ray. I've been chairman of the Twomey series this year. It's been a lot of fun. This is our seventh talk, and the last one is a month from now on the suffragette movement, and that'll conclude the series for this year. We're delighted today to have Ann Surchin, who's a residential architect practicing on the North and South Forks. Ann's practiced in this area for 30 years, and she is also a very avid writer. She's the columnist for the Southampton Press architecture column, which also appears in the East Hampton Press. And she's also written a book on houses of the Hamptons, which covers a lot of the very large estates at the turn of the century, an initial volume and then a second volume. Today our talk is going to talk about what's really happening here with some of these very large houses that are being built that don't have any of the grace or charm of the earlier houses. So the talk today is on From Big House to Bad House, How Authenticity Lost Its Way. Ann?
Thank you. Hi, I just want to thank the library for inviting me to speak here today. And also, just as a little preamble before I start going through the slides, to talk about how the East End of Long Island is house crazy. And size does matter, but we go through these periods where you have houses and they're too big for their sites, and so then you put in legislation that squishes everything down. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's both good and bad. I commend East Hampton for trying to rein in something that was out of control, and at the same time we can go over the top so much that and put such restraints out there that we're so afraid of making a mistake that it doesn't allow for somebody who's really skilled to do something creative. So I just want to leave that thought out there for all of you. Anyway, this is Henry Francis DuPont, and when he graduated from Harvard in 1905. And he had a very famous house on Meadow Lane in Southampton. And he was descended from the DuPont family, who made munitions for this country during the Revolutionary War. He was the son of Colonel Henry Algernon DuPont, who was a Civil War hero. And he was a terrible student. He was probably what we would call today dyslexic, and yet had little athletic prowess and lifelong problems with manual dexterity. In other words, he was a klutz. And in his youth, Harry was something of a disappointment to his very accomplished father. And there was no indication whatsoever that he would ever amount to anything. Now, he went to all the best schools. He went to Groton. He went to Harvard. He studied horticulture there. He at the Bussey Institute. And after his mother died, he worked with his father, and he started to develop gardens around the estate Winterthur, where he was born and raised in Delaware. And he also began a breeding program to produce an award-winning advanced herd of Holstein Friesian dairy cows with a high butterfat content, the measure of quality at that time. The Winterthur Dairy, under his direction, would become nationally recognized and renowned among breeders of Holstein cattle. Now, this is Ruth Wales, who he married soon after he graduated from Harvard, and she was a granddaughter of Salem Howe Wales, who was a managing editor of Scientific American, and the Waleses were not natives, but they resided in Southampton. And she was also close to her uncle Elihu Root, who was a former Secretary of War and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1912. And he lived at Mayfair, which was done by Carrere and Hastings, the only Carrere and Hastings house out here. But what's really interesting is that Ruth took HF, as he was known, Henry Francis, to Shelburne, Vermont, to visit William Seward Webb and his wife Lila Vanderbilt Webb. And Frederick Vanderbilt, Lila's brother, had been a neighbor of the Wales family, and his wife Lulu was Ruth's far-removed cousin. While the DuPonts had come to Shelburne ostensibly to visit the dairy operation, they were also invited to see the newly remodeled house of J. Watson and Electra Havemeyer Webb, the Webb's son and daughter-in-law. The historic brick house, and I guess I will go there at this point. Oh, how do I go? Oh, I'm stuck here. Wait a second. Oh, well, I'm jumping. We'll get to that. A little technologically challenged. But anyway, once they went and they saw the brick house, they were astonished. And basically, this remodeled house was a historic brick house, and it featured two bookend additions that were added on by the firm Cross and Cross. And Electra Havemeyer Webb was a collector of colonial antiques, and she loved them. And DuPont saw this, what was called a hutch there, and fell in love with it. And so when they came back from that trip, he said to his wife basically that they were going to collect American furniture because everybody else had English furniture, and why should we do that? And it's all new anyway. So he decided that he was going to start collecting colonial American furniture. Now, together, the Cross brothers, they were old New York. They were part of the patrician class. They were well-known architects. They did tremendous amount of residential work and even very important commercial buildings. They did Tiffany's in New York. They did the Guarantee Trust building. I'm sure I'm leaving some out. They did what is now the GE building, and these Art Deco modern skyscrapers. So we're looking at the dream team that DuPont put together to do his Southampton house, in essence. And at this point, we enter the picture with Marion Coffin, the great landscape architect, the first licensed landscape architect in the country. And she was considered one of this country's great architects, landscape architects at the time in which she practiced. Now, basically, here are the other influences for Chesterton House. Up on the upper right, there is the brick house there, and it has two bookended wings. That's also part of it to the left. And then there was Beauport, which is up in Gloucester, Mass, which was the home of William Sleeper Davis, who was an interior designer. And he took this house and he renovated it over the years with the help of an architect. And he was the early president for the Society of the Preservation of New England Antiquities in Boston. And this was at a time when everybody was whitewashing everything. And Sleeper, who had inherited great wealth, he took to studying colonial architecture. He was also part of the gay subculture in Boston, and he was responsible for helping DuPont achieve a very integrated color scheme in each room. And this was his dining area overlooking the water at Beauport, which is very dark on the interior, and he redid it several times over the years. It wasn't just one attempt, but that was after the visit to Beauport. That was what sealed the deal between HF and Ruth, and he said, we just have to have an American house, and it's much more interesting to have American furniture. I'm sure a lot of people would not necessarily have agreed with that. So this is the house. It was built completed in 1926. And at the time that he built it, he had considered at a later date making it into a museum for his collection. And so he would expand he thought about expanding the upper floors to be converted at a later date, which never happened, but he he always used to say it just was a push and a poke to make everything look right. And this is from Meadow Lane. So from the street, this really doesn't look like an enormous house. And it's also a very strange house in a clever sort of way. He went on, and now we're going to like flip out on the next slide. This is the side view of the same house. And it's, a center spine with 2 wings, an H-shaped building. And so in the first side, to the left is what you saw from the road. And then there's a long spine, which is a gallery where he was on both floors able to display his collection of Americana. And the wing at the front was where you had the public rooms facing the ocean on what would be the second floor. That first floor was built into the dune where they had all the service functions of the house. And on the third floor, you had the residential quarters. On the third floor of the front of the house, you had servants' rooms. On the second floor of the front of the house, from the main section to the left, you had servants' quarters. The 2 upper right areas were guest bedrooms. And this was a big house. This house was actually an upside-down house, and it totaled 35,000 square feet. And yet, from the road, Cross and Cross were really ingenious because there was a lot of landscaping around the road. So when you drove by, particularly in later years, all you saw was the front. And so this was a way of making a big house look much, much smaller. And this is from the ocean side, viewing it from the east on Meadow Lane. And as you can see, it had wonderful views of the ocean. And it was mostly beach grass. Marion Coffin, you're going to say, well, where was her part in this? Because it doesn't look like there's much landscaping, but there were courtyards that were wonderfully landscaped with a lot of native plants and Rosa rugosa and things like that, and very pretty. Now, here's where the plan, as you see, gets weird. At the very bottom of your screen, you enter what is symmetrically centered on the house, and you're in the entrance hall, and then there's the stair hall. So you kind of smack into the entrance hall, from the side, and you go up. You can walk through into the back quarters, or you can go up the stairs into the second floor. And they had a separate carriage house from this building, even though they have a garage directly attached to the building, bottom left there. Now, this is the main floor, and you come up and you're in that hall, and you walk towards the top of your screen, and you can go out onto this exterior porch, or you can go into the drawing room, or the pine room, or the dining room. And this is what I call a caste system house, where all the servants' quarters are really separated with different staircases and circulations than the public rooms in the house. So if you see, like next to the porch lower down, there's a stair that goes up and down. You see servants' rooms on the ground floor there, and they also walk through into the kitchen, and then there's a staircase that takes them upstairs and downstairs, which has treads and winders. So there are 2 different stairs aside from the public stair, which the guests would use. And this is the exterior porch on one side of the house. It runs parallel and alongside that long spine where you have all the colonial furniture exhibited. And of course, their whole porch was an exhibit of colonial furniture. And then this was the dining room. And he never entertained the way a lot of other people entertained. He would have 10 or 12 people for dinner, 14 at the most, with a lot of footmen. And sometimes the garden people had as double as footmen if there weren't enough. And the food came on a refrigerated truck from Winterthur, Delaware, once a week. And including flowers from Delaware. And he picked all the linens, all the silverware. I don't know what Ruth did because he was involved in everything, and even when the house was being done, I mean, he basically picked everything right down to the brand of grease trap the architects were going to use for the kitchen. So, I mean, he was a micromanager of the first rank. This is the hall on the first floor, and then it goes up to the second floor going up to the third. And here we have the pine room, and then on the next slide, this is where sleeper comes into it. This was the kind of thing that he did with color, and there is written correspondence between Cross and Cross. He was always congenial, and but at the end, Cross and Cross wrote to him, and he wrote, and I found this astonishing when the house was done. In closing this transaction, I must tell you that it has been one of the most pleasant operations that I have experienced. The results justified what I often think, that a private house depends 90% on the owner and 10% on the architect. It was to be expected that I should hear pleasant things said about the house, but the verdict this time has been unanimous and more concerned than usual with the results accomplished inside. And on this, I take my hat off to you. That is really extraordinary because most of the time we architects are a little egomaniacal and we don't necessarily give the client the credit that they're due. But you know, he put flowers in punch bowls. This isn't something that was done until the 1920s. He didn't really arrange his furniture in the colonial order. The punch bowl there was like from the 1700s, but flowers went in there on occasion. So what he preached and what he practiced were two different things. And then, unfortunately, DuPont, the family that had the house until his death in 1969, and the contents not removed to Winterthur were auctioned in 1970. The house was bought by actress and Andy Warhol follower baby Jane Holzer and her husband Leonard, and they didn't pay their taxes. They defaulted on their mortgage. The house was auctioned off on the steps of Town Hall in Southampton in a foreclosure action for $310,000 to coal magnate John Samuels III. Later on, Barry Trupin, supposedly a nuclear physicist and a later self-confessed master of the corporate veil, angered the local elite when he bought Chesterton House in 1979 for $700,000, and he renamed it Dragon's Head. After adding 20,000 square feet onto the house, onto the 35,000 square foot house, we have this. And the house was transformed into a sort of a Gothic rendition of an 18th century Loire Valley chateau. It was complete with a saltwater pool, lagoon, with a shark in it. And it had a coat of armor, a Normandy pub. The turrets, called the height of hideosity in Newsday, topped the house. That was also referred to as Disneyland on LSD. And yet when you look at it, you still see the same footprint, the H-shaped plan, the spine. This was just a complete makeover, a fantasy by Trupin. And anyway, the renovation was considered by the old guard of Southampton an abomination and a hostile act, and they resented a sense of entitlement exhibited by Trupin, who did a lot of these renovations illegally, went for a kitchen permit, and then, a whole turret and then some appeared. And there was also, they also displayed a thinly veiled anti-Semitism made public in numerous publications following the saga of Dragon's Head. And it was very well documented and written about. There was a huge article at the time in New York Magazine. So at this point, we move ahead here, and then Calvin Klein bought it. And so he actually pared it back a bit. As you could see, well, there was a lot of landscaping that went on as well. But this is from, I guess I must have missed a slide here. This is from the ocean side. This is what Calvin did to it, if you can sort of pick it out. And then this is from the Meadow Lane side. You can see the same configuration. And then Calvin Klein tried to repair the house, and it was added onto in such a disastrous way from a construction point of view that it was constantly leaking, and all these local subcontractors knew he was wealthy, and they'd come in and they'd fix things just quite right so that they would be called back to fix it again, and he'd be shelling out all this money. He got disgusted with it, and then finally he decided it just didn't pay, and he was going to tear it down. And so what happened was when the community heard that Mr. Klein was not only tearing down a residence that was considered revolting and also dramatically downsizing the new house in the Beach Lane Historic District, there was little opposition to it whatsoever. And he built a very contemporary modern house that was completed just a few years ago. And so we have a house that is really in what was Chesterton House, and then became Dragon's Head. And then it became Elysium for a while when Francesco Galisi, the head of WorldCom, bought it. But it has all the wonderful things a large house should have, and then it had all the terrible things a large house becomes sometimes. And then we're back to sort of square one again. But this is what goes on out here. And it's sort of never ending. Now we have our next victim, the Bowery, which was built in 1930 in Southampton on Meadow Lane near Road D, and it was designed by Leroy P. Ward, one of only 4 residential houses that he ever did. He was a commercial architect. And this was the home of Dr. Wesley Bowers and his family, and they are actually buried in the Southampton Cemetery. But it was an extraordinary Mediterranean Italian villa by the sea, and it was always well taken care of for many, many years. And this is what it looked like about 12 years ago from Meadow Lane. From the ocean side about 12 years ago, this is what it looked like. And it was undergoing a renovation at the time, and the upstairs turret windows are boarded up. Inside it had this magnificent staircase that went from the first floor all the way to the top floor that was made out of iron, and it had wave swirls in it to echo the ocean, and it was the center of the house, which had a little atrium just about, and it was something magnificent. And unfortunately, this was the house as they were preparing to demolish it. So you can say, what happened? Well, it was sold, and the people who bought it said they loved the house, and they would never tear it down. But the dirty little secret was that the contingency for purchase had to do with the fact that they could get a demolition permit, which they did as they bought the house. And so they kept the house as it was for about 4 years. And then, lo and behold, one day, all of the landscaping is being ripped down. People are starting to scratch their heads. And then it was, completely torn down, just like overnight. It's on 6 acres. And this particular house was on the National Register of Historic Places, and that does not assure any protection whatsoever if it's a standalone house. Now, what happened with the Architectural Review Board? They didn't really want to see it go down, but there is a rule in Southampton that if it's a landmarked house and is built before this cutoff date of 1926, then the Architectural Review Board can have its say. But because it was built in 1930, which is ludicrous, the owners were able to tear it down. And of course, we look at these things in 50-year intervals because any house that's 50 years of age or older can be landmarked. So if we were going to do this right, 50 years later from ago, we would be in 1967. And then you could be landmarking this mid-century modern stuff, and it wouldn't be torn down if you went to a 50-year threshold. So this is one that really fell through the cracks. And this house was under 10,000 square feet, although it looks huge, and it is going to be replaced by this. Now, this is a rendering, so, but this is what was presented to the Architectural Review Board, and they swooned over it. I was at that hearing, and oh my gosh, So there's another sad case. And now, my pet peeve battle. This is Mocha Monte, which many of you might have heard about lately, because I can't stop writing about it, and the reporters can't stop covering it. This was the home of Frederick Betts, who was ironically very actively engaged in Southampton Village, and concerned about maintaining the lake of the health of Lake Agawam, which, as you may all know, it's a swamp, and it's full of the cyanobacteria, which is a result of algal blooms from all the septic waste going underground from Job's Lane into the lake, let alone all the houses that predate, contemporary, well-functioning septic systems. And so anyway, Mary Cummings, when she wrote in her book Images of America, noted that the Lake Agawam was considered the crown jewel of Southampton Village, and it was the epicenter of activities around the village, including sailing and bicycling, and you could fish there and eat the fish even. And the Betts family, on a trip to Italy, became enamored of Venice. And so they brought home on the lower right-hand side there a gondola, and Mrs. Betts would go to the Dune Church every Sunday, pulled along by 4 footmen in her gondola, and with other members of the Betts family as well. And basically, the house stayed in the Betts family until 1969, when it was then sold several times. Now, what's going on is that it sits on the western side of the lake on First Neck Lane, among other unique houses, including the James Hampton Robb House, which was designed by McKim, Mead & White in 1885, also known as the Dolphins, Goodhue and Louisa Livingston's Old Trees, which was done in 1912 by Goodhue Livingston, who was an architect, and Louisa was the queen of the dreadnoughts. I mean, she was the one woman, the grande dame, who basically set the social scales and regulated the social waters in Southampton. Down the street was Kenneth O'Brien's Chateau O'Brien, otherwise referred to today as Normandy House, which was designed by Polhemus and Coffin in 1925, and they did a house up at the corner of Egypt Lane here as well in East Hampton. And there are several other Betts houses going down First Neck Lane. So the current owner, Ken Fox, wants to expand his house. It's on 2.2 acres. At one time, this parcel encompassed all of the property. What did I do? Oh, okay. It encompassed all the property from Lake Agawam down to First Neck Lane, and then these parcels were sold off and developed. So the house today sits on 2.2 acres, rather, no, 2.8 acres, I take it back. And I could be wrong about that. But anyway, the point is that it is on the water, and the house is sitting in the wetland setback. And it's really not very kosher to build over the wetland setback. And so they want to add a link that goes to a serpentine garage wing, and I will show you the plan of this. The red is what they want to add on the house. They are more than doubling the footprint of the house, I think by 175%. And they started off with naming a lot of the rooms bedrooms in the main house and in this link, and suddenly that became problematic for 2 reasons. One, the more bedrooms you have at 110 gallons of effluent per bedroom, the bigger your septic system. And 2, after you go beyond a 3-bedroom house, you have to provide a parking space for every car for every bedroom that goes beyond 3 bedrooms. So there just wasn't enough space. And then the owners claiming, well, we're putting in this, this intensive alternative wastewater system, which Suffolk County is going to demand within the next year of properties on any waterfronts like this where the waters are polluted. So they're acting like they're doing something miraculous, and they're not. This is the house as it looks from the driveway when you come up to it. And this is what they're going to do to that. And I mean, the whole addition looks like a horse stable. I called it the Great Wall of Lake Agawam when I wrote about it. And the neighbors are up in arms. The zoning board has reviewed it. I think the hearing is closed. They haven't made a decision on whether they will allow this. And there's so many reasons why it should be redesigned. But anyway, this is what's going on. And if they approve it, it sets a terrible precedent for Lake Agawam, because then it allows other people to make applications to build over the wetland setback. And it's in this iconic panorama. You can see it from Gin Lane. You can see it from the Dune Church. You can see it from the other side of Lake Agawam, and you see it. It sits alongside these other, wonderful houses. So you're really taking, a historic swatch of houses, and you're putting a tumor next to it, so to speak. So we'll see what happens. It's going to go before the Architectural Review Board in the near future. Now, here's a site plan, an aerial view of a house, and it bothers many people. It does not bother me that much. This is the aerial view of Ira Renard's house in Sag Harbor. And it is on 60 acres. And the house is up in the upper right-hand quadrant there. And at the far left, you drive in from the road, and you bend around, and you come into an entry court. And they have a swimming pool and a tennis court and a guest house and some outbuildings. And what is misunderstood about the house is that it's not 100,000 square feet, as has been reported, and it's not 62,000 square feet, it's actually 50,000 square feet. And he did not seek a single variance at the time that he built it. He was allowed to build this house this size because there was no limit on house sizes. Now, what I'm proffering here is a house like this on 60 acres in lieu of 60 houses and a festival of cesspools is a much better play, and it's landscaped all around. You don't even see it. But let me go back here. But here we go. This is, another aerial view of the house itself. And I don't personally know why somebody needs a house this big, but he really did not do anything wrong. So, even though there was such an uproar at the time. But, his house is in proportion to the scale of the property on which it's built. And it was really quite marvelously done for this type of house. Now we're getting into the dicier area. If you look in the middle of the screen, right here, this is a rendering. This was a proposed new house that replaced a house that was torn down. It was a Dr. Thomas house, who was a founder of the summer colony in Southampton. And if you look over here, you'll see this sort of oddball historic house with a very modern addition on it. And that modern addition was done in 1951 by the architect Philip Johnson. And so here comes Blaise McCoy, the architect, and the house on the far left is a newer house, but built high up. And Blaise's clients wanted to do a modern house. And when the existing house was torn down, it had been so bastardized and beaten up by storms, there was nothing original left about the historic district. I mean, not the historic, that's a Freudian slip. But the refrain was, how could they possibly put a modern house in the historic district? And it was often coupled with, it just doesn't belong here. But the reality was, Blaise had to set the house back 100 feet from the crest of the dune. He had to get a variance, a wetlands setback variance from the lake, which is what we're looking at. Then the first floor, that's the Wyandanch Lake, I believe. And so the house sits on that bar between the lake and the ocean there on Gin Lane. And then we have FEMA. And so the first floor had to be 13 feet above the ground level elevation. And so what was he left with to play with? And he decided that, what's he going to relate to? A postmodern house on the left, a decrepit cottage in the back there, which we can't see, or the house with the Philip Johnson addition on it. And so he decided to scale it to the Philip Johnson addition and relate it to that. One of the reasons being was that he wanted to be a good neighbor. He didn't want his house to stand higher than the other houses surrounding it. And he did a really lovely layout. And it was a very nice house. And the Architectural Review Board flipped out, and they really didn't like it. And his client, and they were basically told, we need a traditional house here. And so his client at that point decided they were going to find a traditional house architect. And so Blaise was abandoned. And this, I'm just going to show this one because you get a better view of the little Philip Johnson edition. This was taken in the winter. And this was a house that was built in 1893. Both the Philip Johnson edition and this 1893 House Inn, the one that had been there by Dr. Thomas was Sandhurst, they have been demolished also. And now we have this house by Shope Reno Wharton. When I took this photo, and it was under construction, so don't be too critical of it, I was standing right at the road. So you can see how overwhelming it is. And you can see that the first floor starts above the head of the garage on the left. You go up a whole flight of stairs before you get into the first floor. They used the same footprint, really, that Blaise had used, but you have to, sort of imagine, lopping off a good 8 or 9 feet from the top of this house to bring its scale down in what would have been the modern house. And this is designed by Shope Reno Wharton. They're a very, very well-known residential architectural firm they've worked in the shingle-style idiom for many years, won all kinds of awards. And they said it was quite a challenging project. This next shot is actually from the crest of the dune. So I'm standing 100 feet back on the ocean side looking at it. And I mean, it's enormous. It's really enormous. It's very well done, beautifully detailed, but it's just gigantic. And oops, how did that happen? I had a little technological breakdown. Okay, there we go. Oh, I just went crazy with my slides. Sorry about that.
Good recap.
Recap? Well, you all wanted a recap, right? Well, that I'm just not getting anywhere here. This is really, it seems like it lopped off a few slides. Let me go back here again. Nope. Sorry about that. Anyway, slideshow, here we go. Presenter view. Oh, I know what I have to do. I'm so sorry. Let's see here. Let me get out of here. Escape. Okay, let me go, here we go. I can do it this way. Go down to near the very end. Okay. There we were, okay. And, wait, there's more. Okay. That's basically the end of the slides. But so what I'm getting at with this talk is, we are confined by all of these codes now. One of the other things that happened, for example, in Sag Harbor, if you wonder why Sag Harbor has changed, their zoning ordinance was written in 1957, and it applied for the whole village. And it was after 1957 that they established the historic district. So what they did in that zoning ordinance was to say that every new house that's built has to have a front yard setback of 35 feet. So if there was a vacant lot in the historic district after it was designated, or if a house was burnt down or torn down, that house had to be placed 35 feet back from the street. So if you had a beautiful, rhythmic little street front of all those tiny houses, suddenly the street front is broken up. They now, if you drive through Sag Harbor on some of those tight streets like Suffolk Street and Oakland, a few of those other streets there, Madison, what you'll see is a whole bunch of houses that are spaced like maybe 15 feet apart. They're very tight to one another. And their pyramid law just doesn't work, where basically you cast a line up from the property lines, and it comes to a point, and you can build within that envelope. But the way it's written and the angle that it comes up at has created a situation where if you're facing the street, you can only build a gable roof facing the street like so. You can't build a roof that goes up this way and down the other way. That's perpendicular to the gabled roof. And so now you're seeing all of these sort of pedimented gabled roofs. So if somebody wants to put a second story on the historic house, it's going to be like Levittown. You're going to go out in the street and they're all going to look the same. And so I think that when we see different townships and municipalities write legislation for zoning or downsizing of houses, it has to be read very carefully, because sometimes it's written by lawyers and they do not have the visualization skills to see the unintended consequences of what they may be writing into law. And this is happening all over. So we're being squeezed in every direction. But the whole point of this talk is that big houses are not bad houses. It's how you do them. And also to be very, very cognizant when you read the newspaper and you see that they're proposing a new way of downsizing the buildings out here, because the new way might not be the best way. So I thank you. Yes.
And put the, could you put it back up again?
Oh, can I put it back up again? Sure.
The one across from on Gin Lane, the last house you did, the picture before this.
The picture before that. Okay. I didn't do the house. Oh, phooey. You're talking about
Yeah, no, go back and get down.
down?
Next to the last, yeah, that one.
I thought it was, oh yeah, you can see it.
Okay. Well,
See
let me
read
just
that
put it.
down?
Let me just put it in the view, the presenter view. There we go.
Do you want to?
You see how I think they can, you see how there's one window missing, the small window all the way on the left, on the top?
Right.
I just wondered, what did they just want to throw in some ace in the tree?
Oh, you mean like right here where you think of what?
Yeah.
Well, there's also a trim line that goes across there. I'm not going to swear by how it looks on this photo, and I can't explain what was in the architect's mind.
But it is like that. There's all those windows that like it looks
Right.
like it's missing.
Well, there may have been some function going on internally where they felt it wasn't necessary to put a window there. But you're correct, it's an extremely symmetrical house.
Except for that missing window.
Yes.
So what do you think of the Farrell houses?
Well,
And repeat the question.
what do you think of the Farrell houses? It's a formula. It's a formula. Just like New Sunshine Homes was a formula in the 1980s of small, affordable salt boxes. But with his formula, he makes a lot of money. He's a traded company. He's listed. Do I like them? I just don't think they're interesting. I mean, it's like gag me with a shingle already. So, what can I say? Any other? Yes.
So what do you think would be the best way to write these laws so that you don't get, houses that are, unintended consequences?
Well,
what community out here do you think has good zoning laws?
Well, I think East Hampton is getting there, and Robert Hefner came up with different formulas for predicated on the size of the property, then that affected the size of the houses. Now, is it perfect? I don't know. But East Hampton was out of control. I mean, people, as everybody in this room probably knows, people were building out underneath their houses underground. I mean, and the density, it couldn't take the density. So anyway, I think what you have to have a group of people writing these laws. It just can't be people on town boards who are visually challenged, who can't even read plans. It can't be attorneys who they may get the law right, but they don't necessarily get the aesthetic right. I think you have to have planners, landscape architects, artists, surveyors as well. And if you put together a committee of people, to work at it from a planning point of view, where you have, all the different design influencers on such a committee, they could look at the legislation and they could say, well, this might work for the architect, it won't work for the planner or the landscape architect. And I think you have to have a bigger realm of experience that is put into this legislation. And it can be changed, and it should be changed in certain places. Yes?
Do you think there's overbuilding going on out here?
Do I think? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, we're a commodity. We have this multi-billion, I mean, it just in today's Southampton Press, they were talking about the real estate in Southampton Village being worth something like, I mean, billions, And so these aren't just DuPont built a house because he wanted a house, and it was his own internal authority and his vision, for what he wanted. Now they build the house, they live in it a few years, they flip it. And these are commodities, and they build these McMansion-sized houses. An older couple retires, and they build all these extra rooms for the adult children and the grandchildren, with the hope they come and visit. And then when they're out here in the winter, they're hunkered down in the den, and they don't use the rest of the house. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but we're terribly overbuilt, and you see it when you drive by houses that you don't have to look at a zoning ordinance to see that it's maxed out to every inch of what's allowable on the property, and then they get variances, Or in poor little Sag Harbor on Madison Street, towards, if you're going south on the west side, there was this, good-sized house built. Not a terrible looking house, but it looked like it was a 6,000 or 7,000 square foot house. And then there's this tiny little house, the typical tiny little Sag Harbor house next to it, and it was incongruous. It's just absolutely incongruous. And that's what we're seeing. So I agree, yeah, we're overbuilt. Yes?
Hi. My name is Russell Stein. I used to live here a long time ago when I was the town attorney in the 1980s, when we adopted the first environmental zoning code that addressed many of the problems that you're discussing tonight. I think one of the things you have to remember about codes is what they do is they define what you can't do.
Correct.
what you can do. If they're properly written. We had chaos then, the planning department had been involved.
I remember that, and there was a moratorium.
They were building on Nappy, there were boxes going up in tiny lots in Montauk that were 4 stories high, looking down on little neighbors. Gene Haas was a Republican supervisor before the craziness even, and he designed the pyramid wall, the very first pyramid wall on the back of the napkin. I was there when he did it. He was an engineer, he built his own house on the old Montauk Highway, still there. What he was trying to do there was, again, light and air.
Light and air.
Which is the mantra of zoning since 1920 in front of the Supreme Court. It's basically defensible as an exercise of the police power to defend light and air. So if people are taking away your light and air, or stealing the character of your town, which is just a variant of that, then you try to prohibit what it is that you just know you cannot tolerate. And what happened is we had a 25-year period in here where the building departments and the people who actually enforce these codes, I don't want to get into a name-calling match, but basically they were overwhelmed by architects from outside of town. So we're telling them we have to do this, we have to do that, there's no way we can do this. So the variances started to flow, and the bedlam returned, and I have 3 new mansions on my street in Montauk. The latest one is Bill O'Reilly's. Okay, it's bedlam, and that's why Larry Cantwell left this village and ran for office to try to put a little bit of sanity back into the situation. So I guess my purpose of what I'm saying is that yes, codes are not perfect, but without them, you have total bedlam. You have just capitalism run wild.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
You have not houses, you have investments in things that I can turn around and sell for more when I want to, and they're occupied just a few weeks a year.
Right.
We're talking about absolutely crazy. All the mansions in my neighborhood are empty for 7 months a year. It's nuts.
Yeah.
But all it is, it's another form of investment for the ultra rich. And does it have terrible effects on affordable housing and everything else? Sure.
Yeah.
It's absolutely brutal. But I guess what I'm saying is, you just keep tinkering with it, and in that 1984 zoning code, we instituted for the very first time the Architecture Review Board, the special permit, all of these things, so that there would be citizen input on individual applications which were pushing up against the limits, whether they were on farmland or whatever. We also put in mandatory cluster, which saved tons of open space, farmland and woodlands and so forth. You were going to have total grids. We were the first state in New York, the first town in New York State to have mandatory cluster. That did not go over well with the developers.
I know. I was here then.
You're always one step behind, basically.
Yeah.
That's just true of most governmental.
It's very true. Yeah.
And you have to realize when stuff isn't working at all, you have to bring in bright people and do it again. I'll just close with this. When I was actually writing it, it took 11 months to write. I had a parade of people into my office from Tom Thorson, the town planner, the guys who had done the Southampton master plan and zoning 5 years earlier. We borrowed heavily from them. You know, they were from Up Island. But we had every architect in town, every developer, from Ed Pospisil to you name it, came in and spoke to the town board, spoke to those of us who were working on it. We changed 100 things, but it's never perfect. So
Yeah. I agree.
It's a process.
Right. But
and you try to end up with a town that you still want to come to rather than flee.
right.
Which you got 75% of Long Island, which didn't do that. John Klein, who was the Suffolk County executive, he said to me at a public hearing, he said, you guys have one job. He was town attorney in Smithtown. He said, suburbia rolled over us in 15 years. Okay, we had no time to react, no time to do anything. I'm out here to tell you, act as quickly as you can, prospectively, to prevent the worst of it.
Can I answer this?
Where we are. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Linda,
Can I ask-
Linda, speaking to the microphone.
Thanks. And what do you think about having real estate agents making decisions on village CBA applications?
Is that not a conflict of interest?
It can be, it
It
can.
can be, or is it, or isn't it?
It depends on whether the real estate agent has real ethics, you know, and whether their firm.
Tell that to a homeowner.
Well,
We
what?
just had.
No, well, but whether their firm is in any way connected to what's coming before the
A real
board.
estate agent is a real estate agent. When a developer, particularly a spec developer, this is what happened on my laneway in this last few months. When a spec developer comes and asks a real estate agent, now this spec developer wants every bell and whistle he can put into his house so that it will be competitive on a market, a hot marketplace. And you expect a real estate developer talking to a potential client in order to make a decision to leave the ZBA committee? I mean, we lost our laneway because a spec developer was allowed to build a 7,000 square foot house and a 3-car garage on Hook Pond Lane. What do you think about that?
I'm not very happy about it, frankly.
Neither are we. Neither are we.
Started working with Meyer.
What?
Started working with Meyer going up here. You know, with the
Just-
spirit of the law as well as the.
Well, yes, actually, you know, and you're going to laugh at this. I very much, I'm not a modernist myself, but there's a lot of modern architecture I do admire. And Bates and Massey did a 600 square foot house in Beach Hampton. And they had all the problems again. They had to be 6 feet above natural grade, but there was a 25-foot height limitation. So they were boxed in between the height limitation and FEMA. And so how did they get a 2-story house there? And all the governmental agencies together really decided what their footprint would be, which was 15 by 20 for the house. And the footprint was the same on both floors. So they had a 600 square foot house. And they were able to make a little house seem as big as possible for its square footage. And a very interesting house. The walls can't out, even though the floor plan is the same. There's a bedroom that has a glass barrier upstairs to a study, and it has pull-down shades so that when the shades are up, you feel like the whole half of the house is open. But when the shades are down, you have privacy, and the glass wall is acoustical privacy. And downstairs, it's all an open plan on the first floor pretty much. And this elevated plinth, 6 feet above grade that they sit on, is all filled with natural beach grass, so and native grasses. So it looks like it's just part of that landscape, and it's sort of nesting there. And it looks like it always belonged, and it was on a 1/4 acre. And the people had the lot for 40 years, and then they got up one morning, they were going to build their little retirement house there, and they realized that it was going to be a very hard thing to do. And so here they went, and they did a very sensitive and a challenging job that looks just great. And there's certain people whose work I like out here a lot. And they're local architects, actually. So I don't know what else I could say. Yes?
Judy, here. Let me give you that.
Oh, thank you. Is there any regulation as to landscaping? Example, the height and the number of hedges
Well,
that can cover up all this beautiful open landscape that we used to have, and now so much is covered up. I mean, is there any cutting back on that?
well, it's interesting you bring that up because I don't know what is required in every municipality here, but I can tell you that I'm the vice chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission in Southold, and in Orient, we're having New Yorkers come out, and the beautiful thing about Orient was that nobody had a privet hedge for 200 years. And everybody's lawn flowed onto the neighbor's lawn, and you didn't know where one property started and the other one ended. And so it made the whole village seem much more open. And now they're putting these up. And so this is a National Register Historic District. And we've been discussing on our board going to the town board and say, look, you can't do this because you're actually putting an architectural wall up that prevents people from seeing the buildings. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I think it's called for, certainly in some places. I mean, in Southampton, they've had the privet hedges for 100 years in the estate section. But in other areas, we're now seeing areas that will never be estate sections turned into walled communities. In Sag Harbor, there was a house on, I forgot where it was on the street that goes up from the library, and they wanted to build this property they had the property, they wanted to put a flag lot house in the middle of it, get some side yard variances, and then plant a wall of trees all around it and hedges. And I just said to a friend of mine in Sag Harbor, they're going to be in a complete sweatbox. There will not be one breeze that goes to their property. And it's a hot town in the summer to begin with, temperature-wise. And sometimes the architectural review boards want screening put in. You know, there's not a law, but they'll recommend, well, you know, your lights are going to be in this guy's bedroom, and it's too close. But if you plant a wall of privet or arborvitae, that will soften. So sometimes it's not the homeowner. Sometimes it is a directive from a review board. But that's something that should be discussed and brought up.
Last question.
Last question.
April?
last.
You're the last question.
You're lucky you.
Yes, you do. The TV won't pick you up.
My last, it's not a question, it's my own statement, and it is my fear, and I'm very pessimistic about it. When I see the Farrell houses going up in Amagansett and around town, what I see are tomorrow's hotels. And I think there will come a time, and hopefully I'm not going to be around to see it, when all of these huge houses become hotels in order to accommodate all the people that want to come out here and spend the summer. Wait and see.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I want to thank Ann for giving such a nice talk. And we'll see you October 19th for the suffrage movement in East Hampton, Long Island, in New York State, with Arlene Hinkemeyer, our speaker, who is right here. Thank you.